Hey everybody, my name is Mark Wolf. I discovered the grand unified theory of game design, and today we're going to be talking more about competition. So in the description below, I've put an updated primer for the theorem that you can check out, and that's got the short clarification of terms, one of which is competition. And so it says down below that a competition is an activity where players utilize limited resources to achieve conflicting goals. But here we're going to expand on that a little bit, talk about more what those terms mean, and talk about how it affects game design. So a real game starts by being a competition with victory conditions, and that's why it's at the top there. What is a competition? To say a little bit more here, we can add a little bit more to that clarification definition, and we can say that a competition is an activity where at least two players utilize limited resources that define the environment of the competition in order to achieve conflicting goals. These goals are known as victory conditions, and they define the scope of this activity that we call a game. So to recap, a competition has at least two players, an environment defined by limited resources, a scope defined by conflicting victory conditions, and in order to achieve victory, these players must utilize those limited resources. Now let's talk a little more about victory conditions, and we're going to come back to the two players thing here in a second. So victory conditions are, in simple terms, a goal state. So this is the scope of the game in its entirety, but not its environment. The resources are what define the environment. Now let's talk a little more about that environment defined by those limited resources. And here we can come back to the two-player thing that I mentioned before. So I think a lot of people are going to get caught up for a moment on the players thing in the competition, because when you think about this in terms of like an RPG or whatever, what is obvious here is that yes, this does include enemies and things that you'd be fighting against. But I kind of want to back away from that for just a second, because that is a much higher level of gameplay, and we'll kind of get into that, or not game design, I mean. And it's really important to understand at the most basic level how to think about limited resources before you try and build up, a big dynamic world. The limited resources defining the environment is really important to understand, because this is how you're going to build your game. So when you think about limited resources and the environment, everything in your game is a limited resource. And the example that I like to think of is, ironically enough, the sport football. Everything in the game, or the sport that you're playing there, or that you're watching, is a limited resource. The field is only a certain size. There's only a certain number of players. There's a set time. Things only score certain numbers of points. And all of these things are really important for defining the dynamics of football. Everything happens in terms of these limited resources. And so it's not like, I'm not necessarily talking about like things that you could mine or collect in, an open world. Everything in a game that you want to build is going to be this abstracted concept of a limited resource that a competitor is utilizing, which again can be the player, or it can be an enemy, and we'll get more into that in a second here, is using to achieve that conflicting goal. And so before we get into that, I want to talk about what conflicting means. So let's use a negative example, what not to do. So the example here is Tetris. When you're playing two-player Tetris, it's not really a competition. You're not competing against your opponent, because what you do would be the same regardless of whether or not they were there, and the same is true for them. It's more just mutually testing your skills on the same platform. That's it. When you have a competition, the goal cannot be mutually achieved. When you're in a first-person shooter, only one team can get the most number of kills. Or if you're playing capture the flag, only one team can get to 3 flags captured first before the other. And you could even add other goals to that, like in things like first-person shooters, because somebody was asking about that in a comment on the theory video, actually. So they were asking about real-time games. And although you want to be careful not to turn it into a sport, you can do a lot with making the gameplay more interesting in something like a classic FPS by adding in different goal states or, changing goal states. But the thing to understand is that when you do that, you're creating a platform of limited resources that can address or that can achieve that goal. So what I mean by that is, and here we get into the enemy discussions and kind of that higher level thing that I wanted to get away from at first, is that when let's say you're building something like Zelda, let's say you are trying to build an RPG, a lot of your instincts or you're going to waste a lot of time and a lot of frustrating effort trying to make everything work together and make it dynamic and make the monsters unique and everything. But it's so much easier than that. So what you need to focus on is the fact that the monsters are using the same stats as the characters. So when you build your character in the game, because, unlike Zelda, we have customization of strategy here in a real game. So we're going to make our character, but we're going to do so within the same limits that the enemies are operating in. And this creates a competition. And this creates the illusion of all of that flavor that you're looking to apply. This does that for you. Now you really can just make it look pretty and everything will flow together seamlessly. So what you want to do in something like that situation is create dynamic attacks, or not specifically attacks. What I mean is not attack patterns, and actually we'll talk about that here, but give them like abilities and things like a limited resource could be an ability on a cooldown, or the range of an ability, the rate at which you heal, how much damage you do. These things are all limited resources, but it's not like the monsters are playing a different game than you. And if that's the way you approach it as a designer, that's going to be very frustrating. So you want to make sure that to make it easier on yourself, you put the monsters in design in the same realm stat-wise as the players. Those are the resources they're working with. They're choosing from the same ability pool. And this makes it so, and here's what I wanted to get to with more of the design of those monsters, because this does come up in competition, but we'll sort of expand that out back to the bigger dynamic world that I was talking about in a second here, is instead of giving monsters attack routines, which takes agency away from the player, just like Ego Raptor was saying in the Link to the Past versus Ocarina of Time video, it's terrible when a monster's attack pattern takes agency away from you because you're just waiting. You literally stop playing the game and just wait for the game to tell you it's time to attack. That's what's happening. A lot of that is also kind of true for weaker designs like Pokemon or Final Fantasy, some of the Final Fantasies, although those have other problems. But what you want to do, and there's a bunch of other people making videos talking about this kind of stuff for like D&D, for improving D&D monsters, give them a goal to achieve and give them the abilities that they use to achieve that goal. Now when they meet the player, instead of the player always doing the same thing regardless of who they are, because the monster's on an attack routine, the monster responds to what the player does. Every single time a player approaches that monster, it's always the same monster, but it's always different depending on the player. That's interesting. That's good design. And so building that to a bigger world, bringing the talk back to competition. So um, you 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 really want to try and start with simpler designs. I it's going to be very frustrating to try and start with a giant open world if you're trying to make a real game before mastering these things. And the reason is because what you want to end up with is a very dynamic world where you have all of these very well-designed monsters, and you avoid things like grind. Grind is it's a completely wrong design instinct. It's really just giving players a simulation. That's what it's breaking. It's making them do work because the thought is, oh, if those resources for them to collect existed in the world, they'd just be scattered everywhere. That's exploration, but that's not really exploration. Um, and so in a competition, you do have those smaller scale competitions that are just combat between, Zelda and a moblin. But at the larger scale, what you want is a dynamic competition between Link and Ganon. If I said Zelda earlier, I meant Link. Between Link and a moblin. You want a bigger dynamic competition, the overarching competition between Link and Ganon. And this is why Zelda isn't a game, because although it does have that competition aspect, it really doesn't take any strategy. It chooses the strategy for you. Even in NES Zelda, where there's no order in which you have to do the dungeons, every dungeon is solved in one way. You can only approach it that way. You can use different items to do it, but you're still having to work through the same thing. And there is just an end to the game. That's it. You just defeat Ganon, the game craps out. There's nothing after that. So it's sort of like having a movie with extra steps, but I guess in Zelda scenes can happen in a different order. And that's just really terrible. A video game, especially something like an RPG, shouldn't just be a movie with extra steps. If that's your intention, just make a movie, just make an anime. If you're going to try and make Final Fantasy, don't. Just make an anime. Because instead what you're doing is telling a player, you can play through this game, quote unquote game, but instead of all these things in the cool world that you see that you'd want to go off and do or care about, you can't. None of those things matter. The only thing that matters is doing the things that get you through the plot. Be here at this time, do this thing, or the story doesn't move forward. It would be so much better if the story was what the player was doing. So when you have a big dynamic world, you have monsters that can respond to what the player is doing. You can have environments that maybe are suited better for certain things. Maybe if you choose stealth as your build, certain things are going to be harder. But no matter what your strategy, you can approach the same dungeon. But it's going to be dynamic. So what I mean by that is, instead of a game that just ends, let's say after you defeat Ganon, he's in the sealed world now. Now you have a saved world to run around in. This should be the best part of the game. You got through the crappy part of the game. Now you can have fun. But the way that Zelda works, no, that's where the game ends. You get through the crappy part and then the game ends. It's like, wait, what? I don't get to enjoy the saved world? But that's the fun part. Getting to that saved world and seeing that there are things that happen that break down that barrier, keeping Ganon sealed. More things, more conflicts come out, and they can be dynamic, they can be changing, they can be different every time. And it's very easy to do that once you realize that you're building goals that are achieved by limited resources. And then you can just branch out and tree that however complexly you want, but start by making that simple. Start with figuring out how to do that on a simple scale, and then branch out from there. Here's an example of like stealth, because I think that's a really hard thing for a lot of people to design. So one of the ideas that I was thinking is, like, if you're sneaking around, you could think of it much more like Metroid or Castlevania. So no matter what your character build is, you're going to go through the same hallway, you're going to face the same monsters, but you're going to approach it differently. You're going to do different things if, say, you're a melee fighter, or if you're a ranged fighter, or if you prefer stealth, or if you prefer this or that. Whatever the game, whatever the full customization of strategy, whatever that range is in that game, you're going to have to do things based on your strategy through that hallway. And let's say you chose stealth. So when you go through there, the monsters are just as dynamic as players. So instead of there simply being, guards that are easier to get around, or instead of there only being one way to get in, let's say you could actually affect what the guards were doing. You could, throw something to make a noise and distract the guards. They go, oh, what's that? And they go off to check it, and then you run through the door. Or maybe you could use some kind of, magic ability to figure out which guards were the easiest to sneak past, which of them was the least perceptive. Or even better, as an exploration, maybe while you were sneaking around, part of what you were doing was testing out which guards were the easiest, which guards noticed you the fastest, and then that's where you choose to make entry into the castle. And these are things that are easy to make dynamic, because when you understand that it's really just that simple, now you just, randomize what guards are on duty. And now every time the player approaches that castle, no matter what iteration it is, it's going to be interesting for them, because they're utilizing limited resources to achieve a conflicting goal. They're trying to get past that guard. And it would be completely different in the same game if you were a melee fighter. You wouldn't be doing that. You'd be trying to fight your way through, the front door. And in that case, the resources you're using and the competition you're having with your enemies is, how fast you heal, like I was saying earlier, how much damage you're doing. Are you more of a dexterous fighter, or are you more of a tank? How are you mitigating that strategy? Maybe the enemies, are better at fighting you, better at fighting your build. So when you go to fight that specific castle, as part of your strategy to mitigate the fact that they have counters to you. So those are all interesting things. You don't have to make a player go and search for those. It should be obvious to them. If the fighter needs to get something to get through that dungeon, it should be available to them at the town, or and this is what I mean by better exploration, because instead now they're not just wasting time aimlessly searching for a resource. Exploration is, you've chosen a strategy. Now you can go out and face whatever challenges you find. That's interesting exploration. And so I think I'm actually probably going to wrap this discussion up here. There's still a whole lot more to say. There's a whole lot of bunch of other topics that I want to get into more, doing videos on tabletop RPGs, module writing, video game RPGs, FPS, although maybe not too much FPSs because I'm not too much into those, but there are a few things I could say about it, but just like, and then of course there's a few things that I really want to say about making new genres, because I think that's not quite something people have wrapped their heads around yet. Is there's so much of this lazy mentality in game design that says, well, if it could have been done, it would have been done already, or everything's already been done before, and it's like nobody's going to do anything new. Don't bother with being innovative. No, don't listen to those people. Those people are idiots. Okay. Um, Using the grand unified theory of game design, you can invent entirely new genres that people have never played before. Don't be afraid to try and do that if that's something you have an idea for. And use the grand unified theory of game design to make bringing that to life easy. Don't make it hard on yourself. Make it easy and make it good. Make it real. But yeah, I definitely want to do some more follow-up discussions. I'm sure this one has gotten insanely long. What are we at here? Yeah, we're almost, oh, we're actually not past 25 minutes. Okay. So I'm going to end it here and hopefully get more discussions up soon. Not sure what's going on, but we'll figure it out. Thanks for listening, and see you in the next one.